You'll regret this before sunset. The words were calm, almost gentle, but they landed in the silent factory like a bolt of lightning. For one brief second, every conversation stopped. Forklifts paused. Computer keyboards went still. Even the steady hum of the assembly line seemed to fade beneath the weight of those 6 words. Marcus Bennett, a 42-year-old black single father wearing a faded blue maintenance uniform with 15 years of service stitched above the pocket, slowly unclipped his employee badge and held it in his hand. Across from him stood Ethan Caldwell, the newly appointed regional operations director, dressed in a perfectly tailored gray suit that looked completely out of place among steel beams, concrete floors, and hardworking people. Ethan smiled with the quiet confidence of a man who believed titles mattered more than character. He folded his arms and nodded toward the security officers waiting several feet away. "You heard me, Marcus. You're finished here." No one stepped forward to defend him. Dozens of employees watched from behind safety rails and workstations, their expressions trapped somewhere between disbelief and fear. Marcus recognized nearly every face. Men and women he had trained. Parents who shared pictures of their children during lunch breaks. Veterans who had spent decades inside these walls. Young technicians who still asked him for advice whenever a machine made a strange sound. Yet not one of them dared speak. They couldn't. Jobs like these paid mortgages, bought groceries, and kept health insurance active. Marcus understood that better than anyone. He looked down at the company badge resting quietly in his palm. 15 years represented by a piece of plastic no bigger than a credit card. 15 years of arriving before sunrise. 15 years of leaving after everyone else had gone home. 15 years of fixing problems long before executives upstairs even knew they existed. Ethan took one impatient step closer. "Still standing here won't change anything." Marcus finally lifted his eyes. There was no anger in them. No pleading. No bitterness. Only a quiet sadness that somehow made Ethan even more uncomfortable. Marcus carefully placed the badge into Ethan's waiting hand, as though returning something valuable instead of something meaningless. Then he repeated those same words one final time. "You'll regret this before sunset." Ethan laughed softly, the kind of laugh that came from someone who had never questioned his own authority. "Good luck finding another job." Marcus simply nodded. Without another word, he turned and walked across the polished concrete floor. His worn work boots echoed through the enormous building while rows of bright LED lights reflected across freshly cleaned machinery. The familiar scent of machine oil, warm steel, and fresh paint filled the air one last time. Outside, gray clouds rolled across the North Carolina sky, carrying the promise of afternoon rain. Marcus paused beside his aging pickup truck, the same truck that had carried him to work nearly every morning for over a decade. Before opening the driver's door, he reached into his wallet and looked at a small photograph tucked behind his driver's license. It showed his 9-year-old daughter, Ava, missing her front tooth, smiling with the kind of joy only children could carry. That smile reminded him exactly why he never let pride make his decisions. He slipped the picture back into place, climbed behind the wheel, rested both hands on the steering wheel, and stared through the windshield as raindrops began tapping softly against the glass. His phone rested silently on the passenger seat. He looked at it for several long seconds before finally picking it up. He scrolled past dozens of contacts without hesitation until his thumb stopped on a single name. Marcus took one slow breath, pressed the call button, and waited while the line rang once, then twice. The moment someone answered, he spoke only 3 words. "It's Marcus speaking." Marcus lowered the phone from his ear before the person on the other end could say anything more. The conversation had lasted less than 20 seconds, yet something inside him finally became still. He placed the phone back on the passenger seat and watched raindrops race across the windshield, each one blurring the towering factory behind him until the building became nothing more than a gray silhouette. 15 years earlier, that same building had looked completely different through the eyes of a young father carrying a cardboard lunchbox and a second-hand toolbox. Back then, Marcus Bennett had not been searching for a career. He had simply been searching for stability. Ava had been only a few months old when her mother passed away after a long illness, leaving Marcus with a tiny daughter, a mountain of medical bills, and a promise he made while holding his little girl for the first time. No matter how difficult life became, she would always know she was safe. That promise shaped every decision he made afterward. While other people chased promotions, Marcus chased consistency. Every morning his alarm sounded at 4:30. Before sunrise, he packed Ava's school lunch himself, braided her hair after watching dozens of online tutorials until he finally learned how to do it neatly, checked her homework, and walked her to the school bus whenever his schedule allowed. Only then did he drive nearly 40 miles to the manufacturing plant. Most employees knew Marcus as the quiet maintenance supervisor who always carried a flashlight clipped to his belt and a notebook filled with handwritten observations. They saw him repairing conveyor systems before breakfast, inspecting electrical panels after lunch, and staying late whenever a machine refused to cooperate. What most of them never realized was that Marcus remembered every bolt, every circuit, every unusual vibration, and every sound that did not belong. Machines spoke a language few people understood, and Marcus had spent 15 years learning every word. Engineers often came looking for him before opening expensive manuals because Marcus usually solved the problem faster. New technicians followed him through the factory like students following a patient teacher. He never embarrassed anyone for asking questions. Instead, he smiled and explained every answer until they understood not only what to fix, but why it mattered. That was the reason so many people trusted him, even if few executives upstairs knew his name. To them, maintenance was simply another department hidden behind spreadsheets and operating costs. To Marcus, every repaired machine meant another family would finish its shift safely and return home for dinner. Every inspection was another child whose parent would walk through the front door that evening. He believed maintenance was never about steel or electricity. It was always about people. The rain grew heavier, tapping steadily against the roof of the truck as another memory surfaced. Only 3 months earlier, Marcus had discovered a failing electrical distribution panel during a routine inspection. Replacing it would have required shutting down production for nearly 8 hours. Management had delayed the repair because every hour of downtime meant thousands of dollars in lost revenue. Marcus documented everything anyway, adding photographs, voltage readings, and detailed recommendations before sending the report through every proper channel. He knew someone would eventually have to make a difficult decision. He simply never imagined that decision would cost him his own job. Across the parking lot, employees slowly drifted toward their cars at the end of the shift, unaware that inside the quiet cab of an aging pickup truck, the man they believed had just lost everything was waiting with remarkable patience, as though he already knew the day was only beginning. Inside the executive offices overlooking the factory floor, Ethan Caldwell stood beside the floor-to-ceiling windows with a cup of untouched coffee cooling in his hand. The rain outside distorted the view of hundreds of employees leaving for the day, but Ethan barely noticed them. Since arriving 6 weeks earlier as regional operations director, he had made one thing perfectly clear. Numbers came before people. Efficiency came before experience. Every department existed to improve quarterly profits, and anyone who challenged that philosophy quickly found themselves labeled as resistant to change. His reputation had reached the North Carolina facility long before he did. At his previous assignment, he had eliminated entire maintenance teams, outsourced skilled positions, and proudly presented lower operating costs during shareholder meetings. Investors applauded the savings. They never saw the exhausted technicians working double shifts or the aging equipment pushed far beyond recommended service intervals. Ethan considered those details someone else's problem. During his first meeting with local management, he had walked through a slideshow filled with colorful charts and financial projections before stopping on a single sentence displayed in bold letters. Replace tradition with performance. Several supervisors exchanged uneasy glances, but no one questioned him. They had seen executives come and go before. Most stayed a year or two before moving to another city. Ethan intended to climb even higher. This factory was simply another stepping stone. What irritated him most was hearing one employee's name repeated during nearly every operational discussion. Marcus Bennett recommended this inspection. Marcus says that conveyor needs replacing. Marcus believes the electrical system should be upgraded before summer. Marcus noticed unusual temperature readings last week. At first, Ethan assumed Marcus was another engineer. When he learned the man worked in maintenance, his expression hardened immediately. In Ethan's mind, recommendations flowed downward from executives, never upward from technicians. The first time they met, Marcus had calmly presented a maintenance report documenting increasing stress on one of the primary electrical distribution systems. Every measurement was carefully recorded. Every photograph was dated. Every recommendation included manufacturer guidelines and safety standards. Ethan skimmed the report for less than a minute before sliding it back across the conference table. 8 hours of production downtime, he said without looking up, would cost nearly $1.3 million. Marcus answered with the same calm professionalism that had earned him respect across the facility. Replacing the equipment now would prevent a much larger failure later. Ethan leaned back in his chair. That is speculation. Marcus shook his head gently. It is engineering data. There is a difference. Several department managers quietly lowered their eyes, sensing the conversation had become more personal than technical. Ethan forced a smile that never reached his eyes. Around here, I decide what matters. Marcus did not argue. He simply replied, my responsibility is to report what I find. What happens next is your decision. Those words lingered with Ethan long after the meeting ended. He did not see confidence. He saw defiance. Over the following weeks, every conversation between them grew shorter and colder. Ethan began viewing Marcus not as an experienced supervisor, but as an obstacle standing in the way of faster profits and easier presentations. When another inspection report landed on his desk, that morning warning of increasing electrical instability, Ethan finally made up his mind. He called human resources, requested security, and arranged the termination before Marcus even arrived at the office. As far as Ethan was concerned, removing one maintenance supervisor would send a message to everyone else. He believed fear created obedience. Standing in his office now, watching the rain fall beyond the glass, Ethan smiled to himself, convinced he had won. He had no idea that the quiet man he had dismissed was about to become the most important person in the entire company before the afternoon was over. Marcus remained inside the pickup truck long after most of the parking lot had emptied. The steady rhythm of rain against the windshield blended with the distant hum of the factory, a sound he knew as well as his own heartbeat. Then his phone vibrated once. No ringtone, no notification banner, just a single vibration. He picked it up and read the message. Stay where you are. I will be there in less than 1 hour. There was no signature, but Marcus smiled faintly before locking the screen again. He never responded. Inside the plant, the afternoon shift moved into full production. Conveyor belts accelerated. Robotic arms repeated their carefully programmed movements. Shipping managers pushed for faster output before the end of the day. Ethan Caldwell walked confidently through the production floor, with several executives following behind him, pointing toward digital performance boards displaying rising productivity numbers. This is exactly what happens when people stop creating unnecessary delays, he said proudly. We are finally operating like a business instead of a repair shop. Several supervisors forced polite smiles while exchanging uncertain glances. None of them forgot the inspection reports Marcus had submitted over the previous months. They also remembered that no one understood the electrical infrastructure better than he did. Even so, nobody challenged Ethan. Suddenly, one section of the production line slowed unexpectedly. A warning light flashed amber above the main conveyor before returning to green only seconds later. One engineer frowned at the control panel. That was strange, he muttered. Ethan barely looked up. Restart the sequence and keep production moving. 5 minutes later, another alert appeared, this time from a different section of the facility. Air compressors automatically reduced pressure before recovering moments later. Operators exchanged confused looks while maintenance technicians searched computer screens for answers. Everything appeared normal. Every sensor reported acceptable readings. Yet experienced employees felt something was different. The building no longer sounded right. The familiar rhythm that had remained unchanged for years now carried tiny interruptions that only trained ears could recognize. Marcus would have noticed immediately. Ethan dismissed every concern with a wave of his hand. Machines have minor interruptions every day. Keep working. The schedule matters more than perfection. Meanwhile, Marcus quietly watched the gray building through rain-covered glass. His thoughts were interrupted by another phone call, this one from Ava's elementary school. Her cheerful voice instantly brightened the quiet truck. Daddy, are you coming to pick me up today? Marcus smiled warmly. I sure am, sweetheart. I might be a little later than usual, but I will be there. Did something happen at work? she asked with the innocent curiosity only a child could have. Marcus looked back toward the factory before answering softly. Sometimes grown-ups make quick decisions before they know the whole story. There was a brief silence before Ava replied with complete certainty. Grandma always says the truth takes longer to arrive, but it never gets lost. Marcus closed his eyes for a second and smiled even wider. She is a very wise woman. I will see you after school. Love you. Love you more, Daddy. The call ended, leaving only the sound of rain once again. At that exact moment, another vehicle slowly entered the factory property. It was not a luxury sports car or an executive limousine. It was a plain black sedan with tinted windows and no company markings. The security guard at the entrance glanced at the license plate, immediately stood up, and pressed a button without asking for identification. The gate opened at once. The sedan rolled quietly toward the executive parking area, while inside the factory, no one noticed its arrival. No one except the elderly security supervisor, whose eyes widened with unmistakable recognition. He quietly removed his cap, straightened his posture, and whispered to himself, I have not seen him here in almost 8 years. The black sedan came to a smooth stop beneath the executive entrance canopy, just as another amber warning light flickered across the main production dashboard. Inside the factory, supervisors exchanged increasingly uneasy glances while operators stared at monitors that had always been predictable until today. Conveyor speeds dipped for several seconds before returning to normal. Temperature readings fluctuated by only a few degrees, not enough to trigger an emergency shutdown, but enough to make experienced technicians uncomfortable. They had seen patterns like this before, and every one of them remembered who usually recognized the cause before anyone else. Ethan Caldwell refused to acknowledge the growing tension. He strode confidently through the control room with a tablet tucked beneath one arm, determined to prove the facility could thrive without the man he had dismissed only an hour earlier. Every time a technician suggested calling in additional diagnostics, Ethan repeated the same answer. Keep production moving. We are not losing another minute. Behind him, the plant manager quietly rubbed his forehead. He had worked in manufacturing for nearly 30 years, and one lesson had never failed him. Machines always whispered before they screamed. Ignoring the whisper rarely ended well. Across the building, a young maintenance technician named Daniel stood in front of an electrical monitoring screen with growing concern. He zoomed in on several voltage graphs, then compared them with historical records Marcus had taught him how to archive months earlier. The patterns matched almost perfectly. Daniel swallowed hard before approaching his supervisor. These readings are following the same trend Mr. Bennett warned us about. The supervisor lowered his voice immediately. Do not say that name out loud right now. Daniel looked back toward the display, but he documented everything. Every measurement is exactly where he predicted it would be. Before either man could continue, another notification appeared. This time, 3 separate production cells briefly synchronized into protective operating mode before automatically resetting themselves. Nothing stopped completely, yet the entire building felt different. Operators moved more slowly. Radio conversations became shorter. Even the constant mechanical rhythm that usually echoed through the enormous facility sounded uneven. Outside, Marcus remained seated in his pickup truck without checking the factory once. Instead, he looked through family photos stored on his phone. There was Ava holding a blue ribbon after her elementary school science fair. Another showed the two of them building a snowman during an unusually cold North Carolina winter. One picture captured them eating pancakes on a Sunday morning, both laughing so hard the image appeared slightly blurred. Marcus smiled quietly. No matter what happened next, those moments mattered far more than any job title. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Marcus lowered the driver's side window. Standing beside the truck was the elderly security supervisor, Harold Jenkins, who had worked at the facility even longer than Marcus. Harold removed his cap respectfully. I figured you might still be here. Marcus nodded politely. Just waiting. Harold glanced toward the executive entrance where the black sedan had disappeared moments earlier. I have only seen that gentleman visit twice since I started here. Both times the entire company changed afterward. Marcus looked toward the entrance for the first time that afternoon, but said nothing. Harold studied him for another moment before asking quietly, Did you call him? Marcus answered with the same calm expression he had carried all day. I called someone who still believes character matters more than position. Harold slowly smiled. then maybe today is not ending the way everyone thinks. At that exact moment, the elevators inside the executive lobby opened. An older gentleman with silver hair stepped out of the black sedan, adjusted his navy overcoat, and walked through the front doors without introducing himself to anyone. He did not hurry. He did not speak. Yet every employee who happened to see him instinctively stood a little straighter, as though the building itself recognized the man long before the executives upstairs realized who had just arrived. The older gentleman walked through the executive hallway with unhurried confidence, acknowledging no one and asking for nothing. His polished shoes echoed softly across the marble floor, while employees instinctively stepped aside, without understanding why. The receptionist looked up from her desk, preparing to ask for identification, but before she could speak, the chief financial officer emerged from a nearby conference room. The color immediately drained from his face. "Mr. Pierce," he whispered, straightening his jacket. Jonathan Pierce gave only a small nod before continuing toward the boardroom. There was no announcement, no entourage, only a quiet presence that somehow filled the entire floor. Inside the conference room, Ethan Caldwell was congratulating department heads for maintaining production despite what he called unnecessary distractions. Charts filled the large display screen, showing cost reductions and projected quarterly gains. Ethan smiled confidently as he pointed toward the numbers. Today proved that no single employee is bigger than this company. The conference room door opened before anyone responded. Every conversation stopped. Jonathan Pierce stepped inside carrying nothing except a slim leather folder that looked worn from years of use. Several executives stood immediately. Others followed only after recognizing the expressions around them. Ethan hesitated for a brief moment before extending his hand. "Mr. Pierce, what an unexpected honor." Jonathan looked at the offered hand but did not shake it. Instead, he quietly asked, "Where is Marcus Bennett?" The room fell silent again. Ethan cleared his throat. "Former maintenance supervisor. We separated from him earlier today." Jonathan remained completely still. "Separated?" Ethan nodded. He repeatedly delayed operations with exaggerated maintenance concerns. "I made the decision to move forward without him." Jonathan slowly opened the leather folder. Inside were neatly organized documents, inspection reports, maintenance photographs, engineering recommendations, and handwritten notes spanning several years. He placed the first report on the polished conference table. Then another. Then another. Every page carried the same signature at the bottom. Marcus Bennett. Jonathan finally looked around the room. Who actually read these reports? No one answered. Department managers lowered their eyes. The silence itself became the answer. Jonathan lifted one photograph showing an aging electrical distribution panel. This recommendation was submitted 92 days ago. He placed down another report. This update arrived 63 days ago. Another followed. This final warning was documented 19 days ago. He closed the folder carefully. Every recommendation included engineering data, manufacturer guidance, and financial risk assessments. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. Maintenance departments often overestimate problems. Jonathan turned toward him with calm eyes that somehow carried more weight than raised voices ever could. Marcus never did. Those 4 words settled over the room like heavy rain. The chief financial officer quietly opened his laptop and compared the reports with archived maintenance records. His fingers slowed as each document matched perfectly. Dates, photographs, voltage measurements. Everything had been submitted through official channels exactly as Jonathan described. Outside, rain continued, falling across the enormous factory while Marcus remained inside his truck, watching droplets slide slowly down the glass. He checked the dashboard clock before glancing at another picture of Ava smiling beneath the bright lights of her elementary school holiday concert. A gentle smile returned to his face. He was not waiting for revenge. He was waiting for truth to arrive. Back upstairs, Jonathan Pierce looked around the conference table one final time before asking a question that no one had expected. "Does anyone in this room know who taught me how this factory actually works?" The room remained completely still because, for the first time all afternoon, every executive realized they had never truly known the quiet man they had allowed to walk out the front door. Jonathan Pierce let the silence linger until it became impossible to ignore. Then he slowly pulled out an old photograph from the back of the leather folder and placed it in the center of the conference table. The picture had faded around the edges, but every face remained clear. It showed a much younger Jonathan standing inside the unfinished factory nearly 15 years earlier beside a group of construction workers, engineers, and technicians. One young maintenance specialist stood near the front, smiling modestly while holding a rolled blueprint beneath one arm. Jonathan rested one finger on the photograph. This man helped build the operating systems that still keep this facility running today. Every executive leaned closer. Ethan's expression tightened as he recognized the face. Marcus Bennett. Jonathan nodded. Before any of you worked here, Marcus spent nearly 2 years helping install the infrastructure that powers this entire plant. When contractors could not solve certain electrical integration problems, he stayed through the night until they were fixed. He never asked for recognition. He only wanted the factory to operate safely. The chief financial officer quietly examined the photograph before looking back at the maintenance reports spread across the table. Suddenly, every document carried a completely different meaning. These were not guesses from an ordinary employee. They were warnings from one of the people who knew the building better than anyone alive. Ethan tried to regain control of the conversation. With respect, Mr. Pierce, every leader has to make difficult personnel decisions. Jonathan looked directly at him. Leadership is not measured by how quickly you remove people. It is measured by how carefully you listen to them. No one spoke. Jonathan pressed a button on the conference room remote, replacing Ethan's presentation with archived company records. A timeline appeared across the large screen. Every major equipment failure prevented during the past decade carried one common name: Marcus Bennett. Every successful modernization project included his recommendations. Every insurance inspection praised maintenance procedures that Marcus had personally developed. The room grew quieter with every page. One vice president slowly removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes as if trying to understand how they had overlooked something so obvious. Jonathan closed the presentation and folded his hands. Do you know why I answered Marcus's phone call immediately today? No one dared respond. Because in 15 years he has never called me asking for a favor. Not once. The only reason he would reach out is because something here had gone terribly wrong. Ethan's confidence disappeared. His shoulders lowered as he finally understood the weight of the situation. Before he could explain himself, the conference room phone rang. The operations center reported another series of electrical fluctuations affecting multiple production zones. Output had already dropped significantly, and several customers were requesting immediate updates. Jonathan listened quietly before placing the receiver back on its cradle. Exactly as Marcus predicted, he said softly. Then he turned toward human resources. Prepare a new employment agreement for Marcus Bennett immediately. Ethan looked stunned. You are bringing him back. Jonathan slowly shook his head. No. The single word echoed through the silent room. Every executive looked confused until Jonathan finished his sentence. We are asking him to come back, and there is a very important difference. He stood, buttoned his overcoat, and walked toward the door before pausing one final time. The future of this company no longer depends on what I decide. It depends on whether Marcus Bennett is willing to forgive what was done to him today. Jonathan Pierce walked out of the boardroom without another word, leaving behind a silence heavier than any argument. One by one, the executives rose from their chairs and hurried after him, no longer concerned about quarterly reports or production targets. Their attention had shifted to one man sitting quietly inside an aging pickup truck in the rain. Outside, Marcus glanced at the dashboard clock. School dismissal was less than an hour away. He reached for the ignition key, preparing to leave and pick up Ava, when a gentle knock sounded against the driver's side window. He lowered the glass and found Jonathan standing there alone beneath a dark umbrella. For a moment, neither man spoke. Rain drifted softly between them while the massive factory stood quietly in the background. Jonathan finally smiled, not as the founder of a billion-dollar company, but as an old friend. You always did hate making people wait, he said. Marcus smiled politely. Only when they already know the answer. Jonathan nodded. May I sit? Marcus unlocked the passenger door. The older man climbed inside, carefully placing the umbrella on the floor mat. The truck smelled faintly of coffee, engine oil, and the vanilla air freshener Ava insisted on buying every Christmas. Jonathan noticed the small backpack resting behind the driver's seat, covered with colorful stickers from elementary school field trips. That belongs to Ava? He asked. Marcus nodded proudly. She says it reminds her that every place teaches you something. Jonathan looked around the modest truck before speaking again. I owe you an apology. Marcus gently shook his head. You do not owe me one. You were not the person who fired me. Jonathan looked out through the rain-covered windshield. Maybe not. But I hired the people responsible for choosing leaders. That makes part of the responsibility mine. Marcus remained quiet. He had learned long ago that genuine apologies did not require immediate answers. After several moments, Jonathan turned back toward him. Human Resources is preparing a new executive contract. Higher salary, larger office, full authority over operations. Whatever you want. Marcus listened carefully before looking at the photograph of Ava tucked beside the dashboard. May I ask you one question? Jonathan nodded immediately. Of course. Marcus folded his hands calmly across the steering wheel. If I come back tomorrow, will the people who stayed silent today feel safe enough to speak the next time they see something dangerous? Jonathan did not answer right away. The question carried far more weight than compensation or titles. Marcus continued softly. I can replace a job. I cannot replace trust. If technicians become afraid to tell the truth because they fear losing their careers, eventually this factory will fail no matter who sits in the executive office. Jonathan slowly smiled, recognizing the same quiet wisdom that had impressed him 15 years earlier. Then tell me what should happen. Marcus took a slow breath. Do not build a company where people are rewarded for agreeing with the boss. Build one where they are respected for protecting each other. That is how this place survived all these years. Jonathan extended his hand. This time Marcus accepted it without hesitation. The handshake lasted only a few seconds, but it carried the weight of mutual respect rather than authority. As Jonathan stepped back into the rain, he looked through the open truck window one final time. There is one more thing, he said. The board has already voted. Marcus raised an eyebrow with quiet curiosity. Jonathan smiled warmly. You are not returning to your old position. That role no longer exists. Jonathan's words lingered in the cool afternoon air as he closed the truck door with quiet care. Marcus watched him walk back toward the factory through the gentle rain, then glanced at the dashboard clock once more. Ava would be waiting outside her school in less than 40 minutes. He started the engine, pulled out of the parking lot, and drove away without looking back. Behind him, the factory continued operating under a different kind of silence, one filled not with fear, but with reflection. Inside the executive offices, Jonathan gathered every department head into the boardroom one final time. No raised voices filled the room. No dramatic speeches followed. He simply placed Marcus's maintenance reports back on the table and said, these documents did not save machines. They protected people. Never confuse experience with status again. Then he announced a complete leadership restructuring focused on accountability, transparency, and employee safety. Ethan Caldwell quietly collected the few personal items from his office. Before leaving, he paused outside the maintenance department where several technicians were finishing inspections Marcus had trained them to perform. For the first time in many years, Ethan understood that respect could never be demanded through authority. It had to be earned through character. The following Monday morning, employees arriving for the first shift noticed something different near the entrance. The familiar executive parking spaces remained unchanged, but a new sign had been installed inside the main lobby. It read, "Every voice matters. Safety begins with listening." Beneath it stood Jonathan Pierce greeting workers by name as they entered the building. A few minutes later, Marcus walked through the front doors wearing the same calm smile he had carried for years. His uniform was gone, replaced by a simple navy suit, yet nothing about his posture suggested pride or revenge. Employees stopped what they were doing, not because anyone instructed them to, but because gratitude spread naturally through the room. Daniel was the first to step forward. "Welcome back, Mr. Bennett." Marcus smiled warmly. "Please call me Marcus. That has never changed." Jonathan handed him a small folder containing the board's official decision. The title printed across the first page read, Executive Vice President of Operations and Workforce Development. Marcus looked at it for several seconds before quietly closing the folder. "I accept," he said, "on one condition." Jonathan smiled knowingly. "I thought you might have one." Marcus looked around at the hundreds of employees gathered nearby. No one should ever lose their job for telling the truth in good faith. If someone raises a safety concern with honesty and evidence, They deserve to be heard first, not punished first. Jonathan extended his hand once again. Done. Months later, the factory recorded its safest year in company history while productivity reached record levels without sacrificing trust. New supervisors learned that listening often solved problems faster than giving orders. Every new employee heard the story of the quiet maintenance supervisor who never fought for power, only for people. That afternoon, after finishing work, Marcus parked outside Ava's school just as children streamed through the front doors. She spotted him immediately and ran over with the bright smile that had carried him through every difficult day. "Did everything get better, Daddy?" she asked as they walked hand in hand toward the truck. Marcus looked at the golden sunlight reflecting across the windshield and squeezed her hand gently. "Yes," he said with quiet certainty, "because kindness is never weakness, and the truth always finds its way home."